I'm really honored that you came out to talk to me about trans literature and comics and whatever you want. And I hope we get to buy more physical objects from you in the future. I'm glad we get to buy a mini zine from you tonight. Yeah, we can get started. I don't know.
Yeah, cool.
I'll say who's on what, but yeah.
Just a heads up, we are live streaming this, so mind your P's and Q's. Not that I need to tell you that, but just in case. My name is Mandy Medley. I'm one of the worker owners here at Pilsen Community Books. If you haven't been here before, welcome. We're a radical bookstore and worker cooperative, obviously here in Pilsen, and we're so glad you're here. And I'm really excited to have Hal and Max here tonight to celebrate Hal's new book, How to Get Over the End of the World. It's beautiful, right? Yeah! And also to hear Max talk a little bit about his work too. We do, of course, have copies here, and Hal will be signing afterwards too, right?
Yeah.
And Max also has copies.
I have a mini comic. Yeah. Let me just grab one of those out of my bag. Yeah. They're very small. But my glasses are sort of a situation right now. Yeah, I've got a mini comic called Watching the Human Centipede with You that I will be selling as well. And I could sign them for you, I guess.
Yeah, you definitely can. I'll do official bios, and then I'll get out of the way so that Hal and Max can be in conversation. Hal Schrieve is a children's librarian in New York, and the best part of your job is facilitating comics and creative writing workshops with young people. Your first book, Out of Salem, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature. That's a big deal. And Hal's comics are featured in We're Still Here, an all-trans comic anthology, and the zine Very Online. And your webcomic, Vivian's Ghost, won the Cartoonist Studio Award for Best Webcomic in 2023. And Max is a cartoonist and creator of the online trans-acclaimed webcomic, What Happens Next. Thanks to you both.
So I'm going to start by reading a couple passages from my book because I don't expect that most people here have read my book or know what's going on in it. So my book is about some messy trans teens in Olympia, Washington. I grew up in Olympia, Washington. They are trying to save their queer youth group. They are trying to start a queercore band. They're trying to put on a big show, and also some of them are having visions of aliens telling them that they are responsible for saving the world. So I'm going to read a couple of short passages, and then I'm going to have a conversation with Max, and then you all can have a conversation with us about whatever you want to ask. Within reason, we can veto, and then we'll sign books and stuff. Yeah, cool. So the first part I'm going to read is about James, who's a stoner goth who has been sort of peaceably roped into driving home Orsino, who's a homeschooled trans guy who has a difficult relationship with his father. "Dude, I'm so gay," I said into his neck. I reached up and put my hands in his hair. It was dry and fluffy, like it looked, but I liked touching his head. He shivered as I ran my hands over the back of his skull. He put his tongue in my mouth. His downy stubble brushed my cheek. When he pulled back, finally, I felt off-kilter, like there was something steadying me that had disappeared. "You're really beautiful," he said, his voice so low it was mostly a rasp. "I want to go on a date with you, a real one." I grinned. You would be the first boy who takes me on a date. His hair splaying out weirdly, his sharp, lopsided nose and weird, bright stare. "What's that supposed to mean?" Orsino asked. No, sorry, this is just cool. You're beautiful." Thank God I was trans, I thought. Thank God the people like me were like this. It was better because he was so country boy, ruddy and blonde under his bright bleach job with big arms and big legs and a big broad stomach. I could feel his binder under his sweatshirt, feel the heat of him rub into me, and I understood why people were into jocks, though Orsino wasn't a jock. Difference was intoxicating. Why were we so different when we had to be so much the same? A painful shock chattered my teeth. I saw a big flower opening, taking up the whole field of my vision with red and pink light. There were great dragonflies around it, then oceans, the stars at night, a pig and child walking, worms, a great bird-like creature running. A huge jolt of lightning went through us both, and we shook together. "Oh," I said. I reached out and grabbed his shoulders, kissed him more. Why did everything feel like this? Everything was painfully bright, electric, hard. I was standing in a window looking out over a hill of brush, a cloudy sea. I was older. My hands were wrinkled. I had a dark beard, was wearing a heavy sweater. On one of my fingers was a silver ring with a blue stone. I turned to look at the mirror that hung on the wall of the place where I was in the house on the hill by the sea. My face was wrinkled too, a deep vertical line in the middle of my forehead, more around my mouth. The walls of the place were painted blue. The yellow curtains blew into the room with the smell of salt spray. A baby cried, and I turned at the sound away from the window and walked into another room with a sink and a clay stove and shelves of plants on the cobbled wall, where a small wooden cradle sat in the corner. I reached into the cradle, picked up the baby that lay there on a cotton mattress. The baby was mine. I let go of Orsino, screaming. I was falling over. Fucking holy shit, I said. I turned to him again, grabbed him, gasped into his chest. There was a cry from a large animal not far off. It sounded like a raven, throaty and sharp and atonal. I glanced in the direction of the sound and froze. There, in the sodium light against the house, a tall feathered creature stood on two legs, stooping toward the ground with small, clawed arms. It was over 7 feet tall. The light reflected off its head. Its claws made marks in the dirt among goat hoof prints. I stopped breathing and tried to make sense of its size and color. Its feathers were blue. It did not look like any bird I knew. Ranger the dog barked. He was tied to the line on the tree, and he stretched out his cord as he angled out toward the intruder. The creature stood rigid, looking at him. I thought of Jurassic Park and Velociraptor's teeth, but the creature seemed nervous. It turned and ran, leaping over the fence toward the black line of woods. Did you see that? I asked Orsino. It's not real, he said. I know it looks real, but it's from long ago. It's not here now. But he sounded uncertain. I was kneeling on something velvety and wet and soft. I looked down. We were crouching on bright red flower petals the size of baby blankets. They were scattered all down the driveway. Are you okay? He asked. The ocean? I said. It was me. It was my face but older. That was me. It was the future. He knelt next to me. It's freaky. I thought that man looked like you. Do you make these things up? I asked. The images? He stroked my shoulder. His hand was big and steady. No, he said, they're kind of like possibilities, I think, and things from the past, times in the past when things might have changed, but I've never had anything like this happen before. I pressed back against his hand. That was intense and weird. We held each other on the flower petals, gravel digging through to hurt our knees. I'm going to skip forward. What do any of you know about the need to survive? Jukebox yelled. What, you came out after 2014 and gay marriage has just been legal your whole life and you're chill? Most of the kids were silent. One or two of them looked ready to start yelling themselves. Behind me, Opal made a noise. I glanced at them and made eye contact. Jesus, they muttered. Jukebox turned briefly toward Opal and seemed about to open their mouth, and then they thought better of it. They let out a long exhale. Venus said loudly, drawing out the vowel sound to give everyone time to look at her. If we're doing big political commentary, I think we're probably not going to fit all of those ideas into a worm, respectfully. I agree, said Opal. You wrote this script, Jukebox said. Yeah, Opal said, but I was just trying to be funny and get people to donate to Compton. It's funny that James is a cow. We have to dedicate our lives to do things that save the world. The show is this weekend. Can we just focus on practicing? Jukebox put a hand on their heart as if they were going to rip it out. The moment where someone opens to new ideas about what's possible is the moment revolution starts. They paused as if trying to let this sink in. I think the moment revolution starts is when you have a bunch of oppressed-ass people who want the same thing, Sophie said, deadpan. For instance, we are all being oppressed by your loud-ass voice, and we all want to leave. Jukebox rounded on Sophie again. Why don't you leave, then? Sophie started for the door. Okay, I think we're done for today, Opal said loudly, their voice shaking a little. Jukebox, I think you need to calm the fuck down. They put their drumsticks into their vest. You're putting a ton of work into this, but no yelling, okay? I don't like that shit. Gemma had figured out there was a fight going on and was sidling toward the stage, holding her arms delicately to either side with her wrists at angles like she was a moth that was going to fan away the conflict. She seemed like she wasn't sure how to directly step onto the stage. Okay, everyone, she said. I'm hearing a lot of accusations and bad feeling right now. Let's step back. Opal turned their wheels and rolled down the ramp and into the dressing room. In the dressing room, I grabbed my stuff and texted my mom. Opal was asking where Barb was. Hey, Ian, James said. He was changing his shirt and taking too long to put the new one on. I knew it was because he was proud of his scars. I let myself look at his chest a second too long. Do you want to watch Barbarella with me and Orsino this weekend after the show? I miss sleepovers. I felt tears spring to my eyes and a lump in my throat. I needed to tell him again, but I couldn't. I turned away, pretending to rummage in my bag. No, I said. I can't. I'm grounded. Aren't you grounded? Only when I'm at my dad's house, James said. My mom and him had a fight. She was supposed to drive me home, Opal said. The edge had gone out of their voice, and now they just looked exhausted. They looked to James. Can you take me? James was strenuously taking off the cow pants. I watched the shape of his ass and his legs and his black underwear as he turned, extracting his feet from fake fur. I was surprised Orsino wasn't in here with him, watching him undress. I came here with Jukebox, he said. I could ask if they could drive you. Opal grimaced. Not my fave plan, Monique. I got work, I said. I took a late shift because I need money. My mom's making me take the bus. Wait, James said, turning to me. Are you really going by Monique? Yes, I said. My voice was a whisper, but not on purpose. Cool, James said. He looked like he wanted to ask more. I turned toward Opal to avoid the question I knew was coming. Opal had their head in their hands. God, they said, today was a mess. Gemma's useless. Why does every adult have to be like this? James had finished taking off the pants. I think Jukebox will still drive you, Opal. It's not about you. He shoved the cow pants into his backpack and dashed toward the door in his socks. I'll check. Be right back. Opal waited until the door closed to tilt their head to me. Hey, I'm sorry for saying stick it out, they said. I think we can call this shit right now. Let the fucking nonprofit fail. This is demented. The only person having a good time is James. No way, I said. This is demented, but it's important. Thanks for listening to me read. You can buy this book if you want. You could also get it from a library, but support your local bookstore. Buy something while you're here.
Libraries are cool too.
Yeah. So now we're going to talk. I think probably everyone here has at least read some of What Happens Next, which is a story about trans people recovering from adolescence and also, among other things, and navigating online communities and navigating the carceral response to violence and navigating addiction and friendships ending. I love your comic because of your highly cinematic sense of storytelling. I think you use visuals with language really economically to communicate like a massive amount of nuance and emotional feeling in a very simple style. I think it's really remarkable. And I also really think that the way you're able to capture the subtleties of online life and interaction and the particularities of existence online really, really well. I think you're a really great storyteller about those things. I mostly avoid online shit in this book because I feel like you can only really deal with one kind of social. I can only deal with one kind of social interaction at a time. But both What Happens Next and Vivian's Ghost are kind of about the same kind of online pain of trans teens. And the kind of gaps people can fall through and their need and desire for each other and also the pain that they're causing each other. I love the ways in What Happens Next where we see really lonely people looking out for each other and caring about each other, even if they're doing it kind of badly. And I also really like how you highlight how few options Milo has in the world after exiting institutionalization, and kind of we end up rooting for every one of your characters that you show us, and I'm really curious how the comic will unfold as more and more characters become in the spotlight. But I'm interested in talking with you about like the feeling of desperation and isolation and scarcity alongside like life-saving interventions and care that you're kind of talking about in your stories, and I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Okay. I think, yeah, like, something that I sort of set out to do when writing What Happens Next is at the time that I was first started making the comic, I felt like there were a lot of stories about queer community as people would like it to be, as opposed to like the way that it actually is, and how like there are like I think part of it is just like living in a world where like you aren't necessarily going to have like people or systems caring for you, and like when you're queer, like you may not have like the same relationship to like your family or like to just sort of like the conventional markers of like being successful and like being a person, and you lean on other people very heavily, but like those other people are also like struggling in their own ways, and they like have their own problems and baggage that they're dealing with, and like people that there's like that I don't know, things can like deteriorate very quickly, and it feels like one day like somebody is your best friend and like you're relying on them for like money or housing or whatever, and then the next day it's like, oh, you're bitter enemies because of like something that took place. And even like even as I like talk to like older queer people like over the internet, like so many of these people like have these histories with queer community where like it isn't this fun positive thing where like everybody like feels nurtured and supported. It becomes this very like bitter angry thing, and I like wanted to write about that, like the bitterness and the fear of like being like, you know, like young and aimless and like trans, and just sort of the feeling of like being trapped and you have like nowhere else to go. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that you capture that really well, and I think like what I'm interested in thinking about is kind of how people keep each other alive in the midst of a lot of pain. Um, I don't know if you've read Leslie Feinberg's book Drag King Dreams.
I have not, no, personally.
Have you read Stone Butch Blues?
I have not.
No, this is not an interrogation. But
Yes.
Leslie Feinberg writes a lot about the same things, I think. Feinberg is existing in like a working class queer community, and I think there's other writers obviously that do as well. I love Kai Cheng Tom's Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, which is also about people sort of surviving in flawed queer spaces. But and both of those are set in New York, which I live in New York. But Drag King Dreams is about being a trans mask bartender who is bitter and kind of burnt out, and it's the start of the Iraq War, and your friends are bothering you to go to protest, but your best friend is dying or maybe dying of AIDS, and so you're trying to juggle a lot of things at once, and there's like no room in the main character's life for like romance or intimacy, but there's all of these like kind of really sometimes like really long, deep relationships that are also complicated that the main character is navigating. And then there's also moments of hope because the main character sees younger drag kings performing, and he feels a very dorky, earnest like love for their performance of gender, and like they're like rapping on stage, and he's like, the kids are gonna be okay. I feel like people have been trying to explore the same themes for a long time, but I think that like each micro generation has like specific things about what people are experiencing. Can I also ask about the true crime stuff?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of exploration of what happens next, of like how people are interacting with the idea of violence, and how people punish or call into account other people online, and kind of both carceral institutions punishing people who have committed violence, and also social institutions trying to grapple with people who have committed violence. And I am wondering about your influences as you chose to approach those topics in your comic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like part of my approach to it was like that like people, I don't know, talk about like call out culture with on like Tumblr or like within queer communities where it's like, oh, you put one foot wrong or you say the wrong thing, you know, and people like can become very hostile to you for like reasons that you don't fully understand, especially if you're a young person. And it's like, it's true that like, you know, sometimes these take place over like real harm between people, and sometimes they kind of take place over like imagined harm between people who are sort of like very on edge because like the outside world is so hostile to them. And it like became like a way of thinking about like as a microcosm, like a way of thinking about like this larger I guess like sort of carceral approach to justice we have in the world, where like the idea of like justice being done is somebody being punished and something bad happening to them, and like the idea that is the way that we like help victims of crime. It's funny, a big influence early on when I started writing What Happens Next was the podcast You're Wrong About, which has covered like some true crime topics. They have like some great episodes about the DC sniper, and stuff about the O.J. Simpson trial. And I was really struck by like the like empathy and care with which like they spoke about both victims and perpetrators of crimes, because like I first became interested in true crime as a teenager, and I think it was like my understanding of it was like just sort of like very like prurient like obsession with like violence and with like serial killers and this sort of like performative disgust of like, oh, like I hope that guy gets executed. And it's like maybe that is not like a very like productive way to like look at other people because and so something on that comes up on like You're Wrong About is like, oh, this idea of like when you put somebody like in like a TV show where it's like, oh, somebody goes to prison and like that's the end of the story, they just go away and like it doesn't matter where they went. And I've also like definitely like refined like my feelings about like prison abolition and like police abolition further by like talking to other queer people. My friend Noah, who writes the Commune Notes Substack, and has done a lot of like great writing about like police and prison abolition and like other sort of like queer community topics as well, was also a big influence on what happens next.
Yeah. I feel like my when I was a tween, I was really into Death Note.
Yeah.
Which I think is like the idea that you could execute everyone who's ever done anything bad.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I do think Death Note has a critique of that mindset, but a lot of like with Watchmen and people being fans of Rorschach or whatever, like a lot of tweens, me included, briefly had like a deeply like power fantasy trip about like what we would do if we had a Death Note or whatever, and there was a big part of the fandom that was like about that. And I think developing a critique of that involves like learning more about the prison industrial complex and like the amount of money that's spent on it, but also like seeing in real life like who actually has power to decide who suffers and who gets punished and who gets killed and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And realizing that it's like other people who are fucked up making those decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you read my book.
I did read your book. Yeah, it was really good.
You mentioned something to me earlier about like the relationship with nonprofits.
Yeah. Like when I was a teenager, like I spent a lot of time involved with like Chicago nonprofits. I grew up homeschooled, so like my options for extracurricular activities were like these sort of non-school related things. And I took classes at like 826 Chicago and the Mormon Foundation, and some of those experiences were like very positive and like they helped me like be around other people and be around in the world, and I learned a lot about myself as a writer and an artist. But like also there is this sort of like contentious relationship between like these people who between like these adults who like have this like theoretical mission of like empowering teenagers and like what their idea of empowering teenagers is. And there were times where like I felt like a real like hostility towards what they were like asking of me as a person, that there was this pressure to like, if you were trans, like make art about being trans, or like make art about these things that were painful in your life, for the consumption of these adults who wanted to be like, oh, we're like empowering teens to like talk about like the things that are really going on in their lives. And I definitely saw some of that in your book, where like, you know, these characters are like putting on a show that's, you know, to save the like the queer community center, where like, you know, they go to like groups and stuff and like interact with each other, and like how it is like this positive space for them, but also like it becomes this thing for Orsino, the play, where like it is about something that's very personal to him and like very difficult for him, and it has to be this thing that is like consumable by other people and like has other people involved in a way where like, you know, maybe he doesn't feel totally comfortable with that. And I thought that was like an interesting interplay, because I feel like with like a lot of queer writing and like queer YA especially, maybe it's just like, well, there are like good people who are like not homophobic and like not transphobic, and then there are bad people, and like there's no like sort of understanding of the division, like how people who are like trying to help you and like trying to like help you like trying to help you express yourself like can end up like not benefiting you or not understanding you, and like the complexity of those relationships, especially when like, you know, like you're maybe in a place in your life as a queer teenager where it's like, I don't, you know, I didn't feel like I had a ton of like adult role models who like I didn't know what I wanted to be. I didn't know what kind of person I wanted to be, and I was kind of looking to them for that.
Yeah. My relationship with my hometown queer youth group was complicated in many of the same ways that my character's relationship to it are complicated. And there's so many of these groups that I think have been around somewhere between like 30 and 10 years or whatever, like in a lot of different cities that are there. volunteer run, and they're well-meaning people, and often they do really good or life-saving stuff in some ways, or like, and it's like, if these things exist and it's 90% stupid, but then they save 5 teens' lives, it's worth it. But also, like, a lot of stupid arguments happened in that space. Like a lot of college kids from the town, Olympia, Washington, like would be involved as adults in this space, but they were also teens. They were like 19-year-olds, but they were volunteers, and so they were like founts of wisdom or political correctness. And some of them had some influence over sort of like what resources were being offered to kids who needed them more. There was this tension because there was a lot of kids who would come to the space for support group who were like mentally struggling, but were not unhoused or precariously housed. And then there were other kids who had ended up in Olympia who were unhoused, who were accessing the space sometimes as one of several places where they could get food or like a snack to take with them or extra clothes or whatever. And the degree to which the nonprofit was able to serve those kids at all really, really fluctuated. And then the degree to which that the nonprofit was able to serve kids who were not just like, my parents are being a little bit weird about me coming out, but who were being like, yeah, I'm like getting abused, or like, I can't actually say that I'm getting abused because you guys are mandated reporters, or like kids who are couch surfing because they don't want to be around their family or whatever. And there was some people who really held it down. There was this butch lesbian who had identified as a trans guy for a while and then stopped, but like did it in a normal way. But that person drove kids home every day after support group and like let them sleep on their floor sometimes, and like was being a foster mom at the same time, and was also embroiled in like a long-standing feud with some punks who would walk across her yard, and like juggling a lot of different roles in the community at the same time. And I really appreciate that person. I really appreciate like the trans guy who gave us a long ass talk that he had designed about the history of the influence of AIDS on fashion. His special interest, but I learned a whole bunch from him, and he helped us put together a garage sale where we all like did a drag show connected to the garage sale, and like a lot of good things I think happened in the spaces. And also like so many of my needs were unmet, so many of my friends' needs were unmet, and so many things that happened between me and other youth were like never addressed because none of the adults knew how. And I think those kinds of spaces exist in lots of places, and being able to talk about their particularities is important. And I think the generation of people writing YA books right now largely are people who came out as adults. I feel like I feel like a lot of the trans people who have gotten into YA publishing, mostly trans men, came out as adults and are imagining a more positive queer adolescence for themselves and for others. And I think that those things are important. And also I wonder what trans kids reading those things feel, because I don't know what a trans 16-year-old experiences in 2023 or 2024.
Yeah, even I don't know that anymore, because like when I came out when I was 15, and that was complicated because like I have a good relationship with my family now, but at the time they were not supportive. I had a lot going on psychologically, and I definitely remember like reading, like picking up and reading like that kind of writing by like people who had come out as adults, people who like had established relationships and lives and careers from before they were out as trans, and like were writing about transness, like backwards in that way, where they were imagining like, oh, like when you like just like, you know, like when I was like out as a teenager, it was like, where can I like use like the name pronouns that I go by? Where is it not safe for me to do that? Like, you know, just trying to get away with like wearing men's clothes. Like I would like change clothes after I left the house just to like avoid starting anything. And I never saw like that kind of, I guess, like feeling of precarity or like being out of place like portrayed in like writing about trans people, because like the funny thing was I lived in like a community that was like fairly like liberal and trans supporting at large, but it was just like difficult for me and complicated for me. And there were times when it felt like, oh, like that, like every other trans person in the world is fine, but not me, because, which is a very silly thing to think. But like when you're 16 and like you come out after gay marriage was legal, like I came out when I like in like 2016, like during this whole trans tipping point era, and like the media messaging was certainly like everything's gonna be great for trans people forever now, and we now know that didn't happen. But like when you're a sheltered teenager and you're naive, you believe these things.
Yeah.
Or I was in a position where I was able to believe those things, which is its own kind of luck.
For a while, I corresponded when I was 22 years old, which is not very old in the scheme of things.
I'm 22.
Yeah, so I corresponded with a kid who was 16 who was living living in suburban Atlanta. And he was having a terrible time because his parents were really, really not into him being trans and were being very abusive about it verbally to him. And he didn't feel like he would ever be able to escape. He didn't feel like he would be able to ever go anywhere, that there were no queer people around, no trans people around. And in a suburban area, if you're a teen without a car, that's kind of true. Like, you are stuck for a while. And he would get really mad at me and really pissy in his emails toward me about his experience versus my experience. And he reached out to me at all because he followed my blog and he saw me as someone who was like living as out in the world. And I think he felt both desirous of my life and really resentful toward it. And he said some really fucked up things to me about AIDS one time. And then I was like, you got to cool it. We got to take a break. But I hope that you're okay and well. And then he emailed me 6 months later and was like, I've gotten really into the real person fan fiction hockey community. And I have a lot more friends now. And I think people find the spaces that keep them alive in different places. But it's really hard to get through a period of where you are in various kinds of ways isolated from other people like yourself. And I think finding those spaces and then making those spaces work is like the work of queer existence. But like there's such a difficulty in the moments before you can like have any contact with other people. Can I ask any fiction, narrative, movie, comic, books that you either find influential for the stuff you want to make, or like that you just want to rec or like talk about?
I guess like probably like the single biggest influence on my work as a cartoonist and like the comic that made me think that I could be a cartoonist was Crow Killers by Kate Wirtz, which is a webcomic about a lot of things. It's sort of about like a fictional TV show. It's about like living in like a small town run by like a weird backwoods cult, and also about like, you know, like queer and trans like friendships and like romance and closeness, and like all of this sort of weird like Lynchian like metafictional stuff, and like imagery, and I think part of it was just like it was writing about, even though it had all these sort of like fanciful like elements to it and fantastical elements, it was writing about queerness in a way that like felt very grounded and very real, and just sort of like it also like was some of the like first like writing I had experienced that was like explicitly about the internet in the way that my own work would later become explicitly about the internet and like online community, which like was like what like was and like is still now like such a big part of my life, and like I think is a big part of like being trans now and like being trans for like the past like I don't know 20 years probably, and also just like her approach to art where it was like, you know, like simplicity and like messiness and roughness were like not only like acceptable but like positive and like an inherent part of the artwork, and like that's something that I've tried to carry forward because I'm often like insecure about my technical skills as a cartoonist, and I like, you know, when I was like a teenager reading this comic I was like, oh, there's like a whole world of like art out here, like art by queer people, art about the internet, art that is like, you know, weird and complicated and messy and like looks weird, and like I could be a part of that, and like that is something that like comics can be and that I can do, and that was like really significant to me.
Yeah, word. That's awesome. Also, your technical skills as a cartoonist are really good.
Thank you. That's nice of you to say.
Well, so I think cartooning and then like drawing realistically are different, but I think your skills as a cartoonist are really, really good in terms of communicating information and story, like, and doing it in a way where like with enormous economy of line, we know exactly what your characters are feeling from their expressions. Like, it's really good cartooning.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think I tend to be a little bit down on myself, and I probably shouldn't.
Well, also like more and more people are going to tell you your work is good. I feel like there's been an explosion in like pop YA about trans kids, but I also think that there's a few more examples of like books about teens that feel like they're more for teens. One of my favorite YA authors is Mariko Tamaki. I love her book Saving Montgomery Soul, which is about a teenager with lesbian moms who buys a necklace on the internet that she thinks gives her the power to curse people. And there's a handful of anecdotal things that happen that seem to confirm this. I love that book because it's just about being really anxious, a really anxious teenager who also is kind of malevolent. Very good. And I also love Mariko Tamaki and Jillian Tamaki's graphic novel Skim, which is about a depressed goth Catholic schoolgirl who becomes the target of a bunch of kind of hostile suicide prevention messaging in her school because there's a boy at the neighboring school who's gay who kills himself, and then everyone focuses on the goth girl. She's also gay. She kisses her drama teacher. It's weird. Like, I love that comic because it represents something of the messiness and untidiness of being a teenager.
Yeah.
And I also really love Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera because that also captures like queer mentors being really weird to you. And also the fact that adults in your life might give you something really important and also do something really fucked up to you, and you both of those things are true, and then you like kind of bounce back from it in whatever ways, and you find better mentors and people who can kind of walk you through it. And I hope we get so many more things like the stuff that people make. Okay, I think if we want to go to audience questions, I think we could do like at least probably 10 minutes of audience questions, probably. If people have thoughts. Yeah.
Hi, I'm AJ. I don't know if you say your name. I really love both of your work, and you're both talking about sort of like having come from queer spaces that were trying their best but not always succeeding, maybe. And I'm wondering, as someone who works in a nonprofit, interacts face to face with a lot of queer youth, like most days, are there other actionable things that you're like, that was good or would have been good if someone had done that for me when I was a child?
We live it with a broken healthcare system, and so it is really hard for me to pinpoint like what could be done for a teen who is experiencing like psychosis that did not happen in the spaces I was in or whatever. I'm not sure what resources, healthcare wise, could be made to exist that don't exist now. But I think like adults not being scared of kids who are really having a time or whatever, and offering kind of a space for people to grow, and for adults being able to like take on the weirdness of the youth they interact with, and not being kind of like skeeved out by teens being weird, because teens are really weird. And I think also offering really more intentional kind of modeling around restorative justice practices, because there was a lot of talk about restorative justice practices in the spaces that I was in. But I felt constantly frustrated as I discovered what the ideas of these things are, to not see that happening in the spaces around me, and to see it essentially playing out as like a popularity contest between college kids who ended up being the people running a lot of the org. And then also, like, there was an incident after I went to college where one of the people who was the program director, who was a formerly homeless trans guy who had gone to the group when he was a teen, he was 26 and he fucked an 18-year-old who was a youth. And he got fired, but there wasn't any announcement about it or anything. There wasn't any kind of process by which everyone who had sort of trusted that person as like an elder who was like 8 years older, but like an elder or whatever, like to navigate the power in that space. And then also that guy was like a sort of unqualified working class guy that then worked construction and odd jobs after that. Like he didn't stay in those spaces or whatever. So just like the kind of, just any kind of way to sort of hold people in the really messy, unsettling, painful things that happen in the world, and like offer more space to talk about it, and offer space to like try to listen to people when they have reactions to it, I guess. I don't know. That's off the top of my head. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Hal definitely like probably said a lot better than I could. I think like when I was a teenager, what I appreciated was just like having a non-judgmental space where like people were not necessarily going to like pry or ask questions about my life, or like assume that something was wrong with me, or make me feel like there was anything wrong with me. I remember like showing up to art classes. Like I was in and out of the psychiatric ward a decent amount when I was a teenager. Like I had multiple emergency stays in 2 years. And I still remember just like the sort of like kindness and generosity of my art teacher, who was like fine with me like drawing a bunch of people with their intestines falling out, and like with like big self-injury wounds, because like I was having a lot of big feelings. And just sort of being like, no, like when, you know, like when you're in class, like that's fine. Like you can come in and like do the work and be present with other people. But like, if you're not here, like I understand. And like, you don't have to like share anything about yourself or what's going on with you that I don't want to, because I think sometimes in the desire to intervene, there is like, sometimes like sometimes like there is no intervention to be done, and like the kid is going to know that before you do. Like they're just in a bad situation and trying to make the best of it, or just in a complicated situation and trying to make the best of it. And I think that like that's a thing that like is worth thinking about or respecting. Hal brought up like the whole mandated reporter complexity when it comes to that, but like I don't know, just sort of thinking about those nuances.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, hi. So I'm a filmmaker. I have been drawn to both of your work because, like Hal touched on earlier, I think that like comics are very cinematic, and both of your work or your web comics are very cinematic, I would say. You're really good at building characters that I think people kind of read and are like, ugh, this person. You know what I mean? Like we've all kind of run into those people before, or like we've been that person. What is like I guess just in terms of storytelling, what are kind of some ways that you like to develop your characters, just like from the ground level?
Okay, I can go first. Yeah, I mean, I think that like my stories are very like specifically character driven, and like what like the plot kind of comes out of like wanting to put my characters in a situation that will like challenge them or force them to act. Uh, and also just like it would be interesting if this happened to a guy. Just like thinking about like backstory. And when I think about a character, I do just sort of think like what are like the entire like events of a person's life like significantly like leading up to this point, like what made them who they are, and I try to like kind of like make everything else about the character feed into that, like sort of the dichotomy between like Milo's like interests and like the way he dresses, and like also like this horrible thing he's done, and his sort of like need to like see himself as a perpetual victim that causes him to kind of present himself as like a perpetual child. And also like God, what was it? I had a thought and then I lost it. The other thing about character that I guess I was gonna say is that like no, okay, I lost it. It happens to the best of us. But yeah, I definitely like think a lot about just sort of character-driven writing and like the sort of like all the little details of the character that I was like, oh no, I remember what I was gonna say. When I was in high school, I read like a comedy writing book that talked about how like the essence of like writing a comedic character is sort of like the difference between who they think they are and who they actually are. And it's funny because like that's like honestly just a very good piece of general advice for writing characters. Like a lot of kind of flat characters are characters who just sort of like are the thing that they are. Like and most people in real life are more complicated than that. They're trying to present themselves in a certain way, or they're trying to make other people believe that they're a certain way, or trying to convince themselves that they are. And they're not just existing; they're like performing in a way. Um, and I think that can especially apply to like writing like trans characters who have sort of a complicated relationship to like like the way the other people see them in like a gendered way, and like how they want to be seen, and all of that stuff.
Yeah. I feel like I like to write dialogue, and then I feel like a lot of character stuff ends up being about like what would this person say, and then if it's not lively or interesting enough, uh, making them say something more interesting. I feel like often it's driven by people I have met or encountered, or just like leaning into aspects of myself that I feel embarrassed about. I think is trying to write characters. In Out of Salem, I feel like I wrote just a lot about what it is like to be a kind of morose, depressed teenager, and a couple of different ways to be that teenager. And I feel like there's a kind of like passive deadness feeling that I was trying to explore in that book, and I feel like in this book I'm trying to explore like what it's like when you're a teenager who gets mad about stuff and also is horny. And I feel like Vivian's Ghost is a combo of those things, because everyone is a combination of those things. And eventually I'll be able to write about adults. Yeah. You had a question? Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, this one's for Max, actually. Sorry.
Sure. Go.
So much of your work, especially in the more recent chapters, is about methods of the internet that don't really exist anymore. You know, the true crime girlies are in this very fucked up early 2000s, you know, something wrong and all of that. So I was wondering, especially with how much of your content is just flat out objectionable content in modern parlance, how do you, you know, make a webcomic, spread a webcomic, make a living off of a webcomic that is everything the modern internet is trying to make people not see?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like in some ways, there are a lot of reasons that I write what happens next, but like part of the reason like I write it specifically the way that I do is almost like not as a historian, but just as someone who was like, well, that was real and it was there and I saw it happen, and like I watch everything on the internet like condense and get smaller, and like I'm a young person, but like the internet of when I was 13, of when I was 15, of when I was 17, is already something that like is fading away into memory. Like I find myself have to like keeping up, like having to keep up with like Tumblr interface changes and stuff like that, and being like, oh, Tumblr doesn't look like that anymore, so I can't just like go to the website and like use it for my reference if I wanted to like look the way that I did at a certain time. And like I've kind of coped with that by making my webcomic exist a little bit out of time and apart from time. And in terms of writing stuff that's like objectionable, which I do a lot, is I think again like coming from the same desire to like approach it with like honesty to the best of my ability. I think that like people write a lot about like online harassment and like online communities, and they don't want to like fully like accept or verbalize or deal with like the nastiness of it because they feel like that's giving it some kind of power. And I feel like actually by like just I don't have like I think people have like interpreted my comic in a lot of different ways, and like I've definitely seen people who are like bothered by like my inclusion of like transphobic language and all of that stuff. And I feel like just looking at it and like calling it what it is, and just sort of being like, I'm not exaggerating this in any way. I don't have to go out of my way to like make the kinds of people who harass people on the internet. Like I'm not portraying them negatively. I'm just portraying them as they are. And I feel like just sort of bringing that stuff into the cold light of day is like worth something, and being like, well, this is what trans people like deal with, and this is what it is to be a trans person on the internet. If you are like a public figure in any way, um, and or even just like an individual person who like happens, like somebody like takes a photo of you that like gets shared around on like 4chan or whatever, or on Kiwi Farms, and uh, yeah, I guess there was just like the desire to be like, I don't know, I'm bad at coming up with my concluding points, but like, yeah, this is how it is, and this is how it was, and like it's worth looking at and it's worth examining, and thinking about, and it's not. I guess the last thing is this is kind of running long, but like there's sort of the idea of like, oh, if you're like having a bad time on the internet, you can just like log off and step away, and it's like that is not true for a lot of people because the internet is connected to like your job and your life and like your friendships and everything you do, and like that's especially true for like queer people who maybe don't have that much community outside of the internet. And I wanted to like write something that addressed that and talked about that.
Oh, something I also wanted to say something to Max. I think kind of related to that, just in how you're saying like things I think are very like real. I think you have maybe cynicism and skepticism are like two negative of words, but you have a real way of depicting people with a lot of empathy in a way that isn't like that doesn't like super come down on like one side of things, and especially in how you like depict things on the internet very real. And I think that's a very big thing to read. Like it's a very uh, relatable or a very like something that's it's just nice to see. Like it's like it almost doesn't exist in a whole lot of different places. In that like in queer media, there's a lot of like very absolute narratives. It feels like a lot of the time. There's a lot of very like things that feel like very moralized, I guess, where it's like there's clearly this is this and this is that, and it looks like this. But I think your comic really captures something that's like a lot more complicated and a lot more how people actually like interact in the real world. And I think it's very
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that, and that is something that I'm trying to do. And that's also something that I do see a lot of in Hal's work as well. Um, and like, I like that like the teenagers in your work aren't like aspirational figures; they're just like little weirdos. And I also like in Vivian's Ghost, like the kinds of like sort of like thoughtfulness with which you're able to approach characters who are like pretty unpleasant people that I wouldn't want to know, like the TERF detransitioner and the transphobic journalist, and how like there is still a lot of like thought and care given to those characters' psychology, even though the reader is clearly not meant to be on their side.
Yeah, I do. I really went down a rabbit hole of trying to imagine like an internality for Jesse Singal that wasn't just like
He's so boring.
well, he's really boring. Yeah, so it's like, how do I give something more interesting to his dream world or whatever? And it's Leon Donegal I think is a different guy than Jesse Singal because he just has to be in order to be interesting. Yeah. Because I don't think that real Jesse Singal would drive to Ohio with a trans guy for a ghost's sake. I think that he would do something else. So like for there to be kind of an obsession or like desire or something animating that guy. And I think maybe I'm like, I don't know, I want to be optimistic about people's hearts and sort of like what's there. And so if I can imagine that someone has kind of a redeeming desire or vulnerability that could turn into a connection with someone, it's nice, even if it doesn't.
Yeah, it's funny. I definitely like find myself in my writing navigating like I want to have this sort of like boundless empathy for all of these characters and like imagine like, you know, these are all like real people with their own experiences and pain, but it's also like but they also suck.
Yeah.
A lot of them also suck really bad. And like that's because that's just like how it is in the world with people where like you have these like abolitionists and like sort of like ideals of like ideally like everybody getting along and working things out, and then you see the things that people do to each other and you're just like, Jesus Christ. But like there has to, but I persist in being like, but there has to be a way to work through this though. Like I don't believe that people are irredeemable or that people are just like born bad.
Or that people lack the capacity to communicate with each other
Yeah.
around harm. I think people do have that capacity. I think it's about practicing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can do 2 more, and then we'll be like wrapping up with other stuff. So yeah, you go first, and then you. I guess.
Yeah. My question's for Hal. Sort of a broad one. I was reading recently about about adults buying a lot of YA novels and how like a lot of adults buy YA novels with the intention to read them themselves, and the person who was tweeting about this was really upset about that, which whatever.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just curious about and I was thinking about this and realizing that I don't know that much about like the emergence of the YA genre or like what people are thinking about when they're like labeling a book that in and of itself. So I guess I'm curious about your development of you talked a lot about like the relationship to your audience, but also like maybe formally or like as rooted in history or audience. How are you thinking about like young adult as a genre and what draws you to it?
Yeah, as a librarian, I can say that there's a weird cliff happening with youth literacy right now. I think COVID really, really did impact youth literacy and how many books kids were reading and how they were accessing those books. I think YA as a market is this huge ballooned market that I think started to balloon in the mid 2000s with like John Green and Twilight and Harry Potter kind of bridging between children and young adult. And then I think that most kids are reading comics. They're reading a lot of comics. They're reading online comics and they're reading manga. And what they're finding there might drive them to read other kinds of literature. But I can say that like of the largely gay teen group, because there's an art high school nearby that comes into my library, they are inhabiting the library to talk about gay stuff, and they are drawing pictures and they're reading manga. But I have put out every trans YA on the table, like where they hang out every day. They don't touch it. Like they don't pick it up at all. They are in another zone. And I really hope that someday they do pick them up because I think a couple of those books are really good. But like I think that there is I don't say that no teens are reading YA because I think that they are, but I do think that there is a gap between this massive market and teens actually finding and reading those books. And I also think that part of this is because there are very few books for kids between the ages of 14 and 16. There's this like middle grade fantasy Fantasia with Rick Riordan and stuff that's grown quite large, and a lot of those kids keep reading Rick Riordan into their teens, and then they grow out of it and can't find anything else to read, and there's not something for the kind of in-between stage, except perhaps some comics. And that's a broad statement, but I do think that there's this weird marketing push to like middle grade is for ages 8 to 12, and YA is for ages 16 to 17, so what do you put in the middle? Who's that for? Who's buying it? Who's reading it? And how do you market it? And I think that there's a publishing community that has kind of put themselves in a corner with this. And also I think that adults read a lot of YA that's for ages 16 to 17 because they like the escapism or they like the kind of easy to read style. You can read it in a train ride, or they want something that's kind of fluffy. And so there's a lot of YA that I think really is written for an adult audience who's looking for escapism or to inhabit adolescence in another way. And then also all of the like, dare I say, aspirationally transmasc women authors who write gay guy content in YA. I think they are writing for a largely adult audience, though I think they do find some teens in their market as well. Rainbow Rowell, etc. Like, I think that there's that market there too. And all of this ends up in the library as well, and then the librarians are trying to connect kids with books, but like it might not be a natural fit. I really hope that my books get read by teens because I'm trying to write for teens, and I think it's a mixture of bookstores, libraries, marketing, etc., to make that happen. And then also like social media has totally changed the landscape of what books get read, and like I do think it's a great way for people to discover new books, and I also think it's very like influenced by changes to algorithm and stuff that I don't understand. Um, but yeah, I think YA as a genre development is fascinating because it really a lot of things that we would call children's books in retrospect were YA at the time they were published. So there's a book called like The Perilous Guard that's from the 80s or maybe even late 70s. That's like about a Tudor era teenager having kind of an Edward Cullen thing with this guy on the estate that she's been banished to, and then they find an underground pagan world of like people who are sort of passing to the peasants as fairies, but they're actually like an ancient pagan cult underground or whatever. There's a lot of sexuality in this book. There's hypnosis in this book, and it was marketed to kids ages 12 to 16, basically, when it was out. And I think that The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper could have counted as YA when it was released, and is children's literature now, and it's shifted over time. Sorry, long-winded
No,
answer.
thank you.
Yeah,
That's really interesting. I did not know all that about the YA market.
it's weird. Yeah. Okay, one more. Go for it. Yeah, you.
Further?
Yes,
Okay.
you.
So I know Max.
Hi, Fern.
Hi. But I haven't read your stuff. You seem really interesting though.
Thanks.
But I had a question about like what are your guys' thoughts on the narratives we like tell ourselves in our lives about like how things are going to go in the future, and then when that changes, it like destroys our worlds. But like, you know, it's that sort of thing where like you want to say this is going to happen in the future, and if it doesn't, like that like collapses that potential of like a world that you thought was going to be there.
Yeah.
When that's often not actually how life works at all.
I don't know. Do you want to take that one first, or should I?
I am dealing with that literally in symbolic fantasy language in this book because the aliens are trying to get Orsino to put the planet on a different track, a different timeline, and keep giving him visions of alternate futures, but also really horrible, deadly futures. And he's kind of tormented by nightmares of like climate destruction and war, and is kind of trapped also in this reality where his dead dog hates him. And then upon kissing another trans boy, he has more positive visions of a future. But they're also dependent on certain things happening with that particular boy. And then when that future crumbles, he has to find like other ways to inhabit the future. And he doesn't know if his visions have anything to do with him having the power to change those futures or not. The aliens tell him that he does, but he doesn't understand how that might work. And then there's like an older trans person that tells him you have to do this, this, and this in order to like make those futures happen. And then he doesn't quite trust what they say. So I'm struggling with that same idea in this book, very literally, in the ways that I can figure out how to. And I do think that we have the power to influence the future. I think that that's what makes it worth it to live in a flawed world. But I don't know quite how that happens all the time.
Yeah, I guess it's funny. Like, what happens next is also like sort of about that same internal conflict, but in like in a much more like in a very different way that does not involve aliens. Where I think like I was definitely writing from my own perspective as like somebody who like grew up in, you know, this sort of like privileged middle class family, and the idea was like, well, you know, you'll go to college and you'll get a good job and you have this whole future ahead of you. And then I started having mental health issues and I dropped out of college. At the time that I started writing What Happens Next, I like worked at a Papa John's and like lived in a college town where I no longer even went to the college, and I felt like I had nothing ahead of me and I had no idea what my future looked like. And so I approached Milo as like sort of an exaggerated version of that conflict, where he's like coming out of like where like he's had this like traumatic event of like being involved in a murder when he was 15 that has like completely changed the trajectory of his life and like completely like blocked him off kind of from like being a normal person and like having a job and like getting an apartment, like doing all these things that people do in the world. And the title of the comic being What Happens Next is sort of just like what do you do to like go on with your life when like your idea of what your life was going to be has been like totally shattered in that way. And I feel like it's a difficult question to answer, and the answer is different for everybody. But like, you know, it's just sort of about like the things that happen to you when you're on your way there. I don't know.
think that's a great closing question. Thank you, everyone.